being here, and let's give you a hit started.
Hi everyone, can you guys hear me well? I have self gotta practice speaking up. Thank you guys for being here. My name is Viquez. Thank you all for being curious and eager to learn something more new today. My thesis is titled, How the Beautiful Game Gives Back. Due to time constraints, I wrote a script, so please forgive me if I look down instead of at you. With things that I'm passionate about, I tend to ramble. For example, I know y'all are not as interested in the background process or how I got to the research question as you may be in the actual results of my project. So I hope this script will save me time for the most important part, the analysis and conclusion. So let's begin. I have a slight overview of what we'll be going over, but that's not important as why I started this project. So I've been playing soccer since I was 3 years old. The sport continues to play a massive role in my life, including in my studies and in my career choices. Moreover, this research was shaped by this passion and my interest in international affairs. As an international business student with French and global studies minors, I asked myself, what is one way to make this as hard on me as possible? I know by combining everything I love into one. So that's what I tried to do with this project. The two research questions that my project was guided by was, how does soccer influence nations and societies? The second was, would women's rights improve if Iran and Tunisia had a women's national team or women's sports? Next, I want to share with you briefly the literature review and highlight 4 things that helped me find the gaps in my current research. Firstly, I looked at resources pertaining to barriers in participation in the Middle East and North Africa. It was important for me to understand the historical background and context of the regions I was interested in studying. For example, I learned from data from the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights that the Middle Eastern and North African regions are the regions with the highest concentration of gender discriminatory nationality laws. These are laws that deny equal rights to men and women to acquire, change, or retain one's nationality, or to confer nationality to one's child or spouse. This has an effect on a woman's freedom of movement, access to education, healthcare, and social services, the right to inheritance, and if they were interested, competing for the country's national team. Secondly, I looked at sources related to positive policy growth in the Middle East and North Africa. This is where I began to become hopeful in my project and motivated to learn that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia all have women's national teams currently and use these. Thirdly, I looked at critical moments in Iran. I wanted to focus on 2 specific countries within the region for my business proposal. One of the countries I chose was Iran. Critical moments indicate that this country needs a positive change, and there are fires lit within citizens right now to support it. For instance, Iranian women are currently leading the charge, coming from all ages and backgrounds, demanding justice, reform, and their rights through dance or rebellion of traditional clothing. Finally, critical moments in Tunisia include tension from the aftermath of the Arab Spring. It has been 66 years since Tunisia's independence and the construction of the country's image as a regional champion of women's rights. But citizens are currently angry with the government for not enforcing the current policies and practices in society. After reading up on these subjects for an entire semester, I came to 2 objectives. 1, to learn more about the current sport for development and peace programs and their success. And 2, how to turn my theoretical research into something practical. I then came up with this hypothesis, which states, in a comparison of countries, those having higher levels of female participation in soccer will be more likely to have greater women's rights than those having less female participation in soccer. I expected to find a direct correlation between the data I collected and the interview participant responses, but I was surprised to find it wasn't as direct as I anticipated. Again, to make it as hard as possible on myself, I said let's do a mixed methods approach. This meant I had to survey the existing data and analyze the patterns, then use qualitative data as context to justify and expand on these patterns. My 2 types of data included qualitative, open-ended interview questions that I created and asked every interviewee. All of their responses were then compared to quantitative data I collected from the Freedom House Index. The Freedom House Index is an American research organization that produces research and reports on a number of core thematic issues related to democracy, political rights, and civil liberties. The resource I use is their Global Freedom Map, as you can see here. By interacting with this map, you can find data and the report of freedom that describes how they determine the scores for political rights and civil liberties in each country. Here, I have a sample of 5 questions from the 22 I asked the interviewees. The questions I asked help me to better understand the background, first of each participant, their experience playing soccer, as well as the environment they grew up in. I chose to pull these questions for you today because the participants provided responses that corresponded with my hypothesis. So, I approached my analysis by beginning with the qualitative data, the interviews. I wanted to keep my participant group more intentionally focused, so I didn't interview every soccer player I know. Instead, I interviewed 7 international women with representations from 6 different countries, including the UK, Spain, Australia, Denmark, the United States, and Iceland. These participants, with one exception, are current or alumni of the St. Edward's NCAA women's soccer team. As an example of the responses I received that corresponded and supported my belief that playing soccer improves more than just motor skills, were their answers to the question, what is the most valuable lesson you learned from playing on the team? The participant from Spain answered that by myself, I can do a lot of things, but I can do more things with a team. Another participant from Australia answered how to work with people and how to solve problems with people you don't particularly get along with. Next to these responses, I have the data from the Freedom House I compared it to. The numbers for both Spain and Australia indicate a high amount of freedom, and these specific responses from the participants align with the country's high civil liberty score. Next, after hours of re-listening to interviews and transcribing them, I needed to dig deeper and find connections between the participants' responses in relation to the Freedom House data. Here is a slide of the total number of freedom from each country I interviewed a participant from, as well as an example of one of their political rights and civil liberties questions from the Freedom House that they used to calculate the country's score. According to this data, these countries score high and have lots of freedom. I expected the responses and experiences from the participants to match this data, but I found that although they recognize they do have some freedoms, they detail a lot of needs for improvement. For instance, for the question, do you think there could be any improvements made to the soccer programs for women in your country? 7 out of 7 participants say visibility and accessibility of women's sports is the biggest issue. These quotes from each participant indicate that at times the soccer for women goes overlooked and underappreciated in their country, which means many women lack the freedom and support to achieve all their goals. So then I had to ask, what does this mean for the countries that score lower on the Freedom House Index? These are the countries I want to help improve using sport, but is that even possible right now? Every country has a score below that global average of freedom. Tunisia is the strongest with a score of 56. Moreover, for the same questions we looked at for the developed countries, all of these countries scored a 0 or a 1, except Tunisia, the best score being a 4. So, how is this data going to help me solve the problem? I created a flowchart, which is, how am I using the data to create an actionable plan of reform, as I mentioned before as one of my objectives. The gap I found was the unaddressed and insufficient research done on solutions to gender equality and human rights issues in the MENA, Middle East, and North African regions. My solution was to use sports, specifically soccer, to bridge this gap, using examples from the interviews, Freedom House, and other research to inform my solution and get me closer to a concrete proposal. Another resource I use to bolster my research is the Global Gender Gap Report, written by the World Economic Forum. Iceland remains the only economy to have closed more than 90% of its gender gap. In contrast, the Middle East and North Africa have closed 63.4% of its gender gap and have the second largest gender gap yet to close. Their time frame to close this gap is 115 years. These two infographics I have posted I thought were cool and informative. One shows the percentage of female leadership around the world, and another shows the years regions have to close their gap. United States, 59 years. So, ending on a positive note, this slide is to show I'm not the only one that cares about this problem. Organizations and leaders around the world have seen the power of this sport can have on a culture and on society. All of these individuals and organizations use sport as a tool to meet sustainable development goals and increase human rights. This woman here, Kat, she actually went to university in Tulsa and then decided to return back to Iran and start the women's national team of Iran, which I think is super cool. And Skatistan is not a soccer organization specifically. They actually focus on skateboarding. And so their whole thing is using skateboard to help girls grow their skills as well. And Whitaker is an actor that went back to his country and started programs for sport, and now he's like my favorite actor because he loves soccer. So here's my business proposal. I narrowed it down for the main key points for you to read, but according to the World Economic Forum, it will still take 132 years to reach gender parity. So why not try new solutions that will take small steps toward closing this gap? As crises are compounding, women's workforce outcomes are suffering, and the risk of global gender parity backsliding further intensifies. Around the world, constrained finances from the pandemic, the cost of living crises, global political conflict, and climate change all impact women disproportionately. Specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, women continue to earn and accumulate wealth at lower levels. These regions also lack the policies to economically empower women and the freedom for them to become leaders. I propose that we implement more female youth soccer teams in the MENA region. Getting women involved in soccer at a younger age will build their confidence, skills, and communication and leadership. Thus, as they mature, making them valued and respected members of society through their increased participation in education, policy, economy, and health sectors. Including women in discussions increases diversity of thought, which leads to innovations that improve the country overall. I expect the implementation of this project to take no more than a year, which includes recruitment, fundraising, and finding a location. I also estimate the total of the whole project to equal around $12,000 for the Middle East and North Africa. As a soccer player myself for 19 years that has played at every level from beginner to semi-professional, I see the need for this solution and have witnessed firsthand the impact that it can have on an individual. Here I have outlined team startup options and considerations. I have 3 options from the highest competition to the lowest, but each option requires the girls to be exposed to a team environment and have fun learning the game. And I have outlined here the necessary things to start a soccer team, if y'all are interested. And here are the considerations between all the differentiating options. Again, this one is a travel team, this one only plays locally, and this one plays within the team themselves. I would like to thank first my parents for putting me in this sport, and my family and friends for encouraging me to reach for the stars. I would also like to thank Professor Johnson for her guidance and mentorship, and the honors program for accepting me my sophomore year. Thank you.
freedom between the one before that. Yes, there's a disparity between civil liberties and political rights, and I'm wondering if you noticed a correlation between the prominence of civil liberties versus political rights and how that contributed to women's participation in sports, and if you noticed any correlation between what should or would be emphasized in order to promote participation either in a civil capacity or political.
Okay, so I'm going to take the first part of your question first. So civil liberties and political rights are the two things that Freedom House uses to score their ultimate freedom of the country. And within political rights and civil liberties, they have a lot of distinguishing questions. And I picked and chose which questions I wanted to use because not all of them align with women's participation in sports. They asked a lot of questions about media, asked a lot of questions about voting, and I mean, plays an important role in gender equality, but not necessarily for women to start playing a sport. And so that's why I also paired it with the Global Gender Gap report, because that more specifically looked at women's inequality and that helping more. But this was also important because that's about freedom of movement. And could you also ask the second question?
Yeah, if you wanted to see certain things emphasized, whether that's civil liberties, I suppose, like the promotion of civil liberties, activism, or political rights, which do you think will help women gain more participation or access to participation?
No, thank you for that. I think both are really important, but I think it starts with the policies. So I would say political rights first, because as I had mentioned earlier, one of the biggest obstacles is the gender discriminatory nationality laws, which affect women receiving their citizenship for their country, so that they're basically not a citizen and they're unable to move within or out of the country, and that wouldn't allow them to play on a national team. So I think that would be the biggest barrier first to challenge. Anybody else?
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'll be curious though, what would be, in your own opinion, what would be the best way to encourage athletes who are already playing soccer to hope and hope that there is something in soccer than just playing soccer? The team also plays a role in encouraging other female athletes who will be interested in playing soccer as a game. So what would be the best way to encourage the team playing soccer to have hope that there is much to this than just playing soccer?
Like how would I encourage the teams in North Africa and the Middle East to have hope? I think that but just by them watching, I was also thinking about the World Cup recently and how Morocco and other Asian countries and other African countries have done so well, and how their success was taken back home. And I think that influence also has an influence on the women's teams. And so I think just for them to have someone to look up to, whether it be the men's national team or whether it be females in other sectors of leadership, not just sport, just seeing that would, I think, would be very hopeful for them as well.
Thank you so much. To Stoll and Cora and Emma, and I just want to say thank you so much. I'm so impressed with you bringing your passion for soccer into this project. It was such a delight and a pleasure.
I had a whole thing planned, and then you made me cry.
Thank you.
So I've had the pleasure of working with them, the privilege of working with them since last fall. So that was her honors thesis prep class, which is where we kind of start to plan all of this. And then right at the end of the semester, Emma came to me and asked if I could be her mentor for this semester too. And I was thrilled because I was really excited to see where you were going to take everything that we had kind of planned in the fall. But yeah, kind of volley between, I really want to do something about soccer, but I really want to do something about women's rights, and how do I bring these together? And it took a lot of like iteration trying to figure out how to marry the two. And the World Cup was happening at the same time we were working on all of this. So I just want to say, so I don't ramble either, that I am just blown away constantly by Emma's like hard work ethic. She is involved in student government, Rachel top, I don't even know what else, and student athlete on top of all of that, and takes a leadership role in all of those things, and just has the narrative that you came up with. We've been working on this for like the last week or two, and just how you brought all this together was just amazing. And you're going to Switzerland this summer, right? You got an internship.